This prototype was the focus of my first term in the Advanced Game Design course with CG Spectrum. My biggest issues came from overscoping and overestimating my own abilities when jumping into Unreal. Much of these 3 months was spent learning the editor, which left very little time for playtesting and iteration. My mentor encouraged me to push myself in order to grow my skills and accelerate my learning, which did prove to be very valuable. However, I still attempted to do too much too quickly, and as such, only a few narrative and gameplay branches were completed all the way through. Much of my efforts were spent on unnecessary visual polish and detail, even going so far as to try and fully voice act the characters and add subtitles. Having said that, there are many aspects I consider to be successful beyond bettering my technical skills. My goal to implement real-time player-driven narrative with gameplay ramifications worked as intended. The player is an active participant in the story, except for when narrative events require them to be an observer for a short time. Rather than the world revolving around the player is making their way through a world that will keep on going regardless of their involvement. This makes the setting feel more believable and deepens the player's immersion. Other characters make decisions based on how events play out, and while these decisions can be influenced by the player or other factors, this is not a simple extension of the player speaking for those characters. I wanted the player to think about what they were trying to do, make a decision, and then execute on that decision every step of the way. The world and the characters in it aren't going to stop and wait around for the player to decide to engage with it. The player is either on board trying to pull together a plan, or they're left to face the consequences for being unprepared and not taking the world seriously. Gameplay-wise, I think it's serviceable for a prototype. The player only has one weapon, and some advanced movement mechanics in the form of double jumping and gliding. This was helpful in that it allowed me to combine real-time dialogue with combat fairly seamlessly, but the majority of my focus was on the player being an active participant in the story. The player could talk, and they had a weapon. Were I to do this differently, I would focus more on moment-to-moment gameplay, both in strictly dialogue sequences, combat sequences, and a combination of both. As is, I believe I succeeded in merging the two together. The AI are pretty basic and more of a vessel for the additional mechanics to be more challenging. The spaces are not well suited for the AI or the player's mobility. I do believe the level flow fits the narrative and vice versa. I first take the player through a tense narrative encounter with consequences that impact the rest of the level, then a light combat encounter occurs with the potential for a combined narrative encounter dependent on outcomes earlier in the level, and then a final more difficult combat encounter with additional mechanics where the narrative events are primarily driven by the mechanical events. The final encounter is dynamic in terms of how it can play out going into the encounter, during the fight, and the aftermath of the player's varying degrees of success and failure. Overall, I learned a lot from this project, from technical skills and the design process, as well as where I'd like to focus my efforts in the future. I'm glad this project has as much variety as it does, even at the expense of a more fleshed out prototype. In this project, I tackled level design, quest and narrative design, combat system design, and AI. I even make use of the environment query system, and some AI are able to predict the player's movement. Additionally, I briefly worked with the concept artist to commission representative box art. That'll wrap up this small retrospective series on Proteus. Thanks for checking it out. Please visit my portfolio for more information about me and my projects. Until next time.